Hey everybody. You've hopefully by now already watched 10.1a, which kind of went over the background of Freudian psychology. We're going to do 10.1b now and focus more on the mostly his criticisms and more what like modern psychodynamic theories are, because as I said, they're still around, right? There's still a decent amount of psychologists who practice psychoanalysis. So clearly, if this is something that's still around, it's worth looking into. The biggies that you should know, we're going to go over these: Jung, Horney, and Adler. What they did in shifting away from Freud was that they said yes, some of that unconscious is there, right? Id, ego, superego likely drives a lot of our human actions, childhood and defense mechanisms. That makes a lot of sense, but they moved away from Freud's obsession with psychosexual development. So let's talk about a couple examples of that. Major criticisms of Freudian psychology are that there's no data, right? As we've talked about how psychology more and more becomes this field that is based on science, evidence, cause and effect relationships. Freud didn't care about any of that. He did no work whatsoever to prove his theories, and most of his theories were, I think the book referred to it as like betting on the horse after the race was already over. Right? He would talk to a patient and then tell them what was wrong with them, but he had no predictive power, right? So one of the key things in psychology, one of the major things that psychologists are looking to do is predict behavior, right, and show causation. And so what Freud was really doing was he would take people and fit them into his theories and really explain everything backwards instead of really being able to explain anything forwards. It was also, of course, wildly sexist with ideas like penis envy. But on the whole, a big idea that you may see is that Freud just didn't have any data to back up his evidence. For the most part, it was all kind of subjective based on his own experience and his own opinions. So other psychologists that you should know in this psychodynamic theories, Carl Jung was the first. So his theory was it took the unconscious and said, yeah, ego, superego, that makes sense. But he took it almost a step further and said it's not so much that we individually develop our own unconscious, is that we have this collective unconscious, meaning that we share this unconscious that we don't know is there, but it's a part of us and it's a part of everyone else as well. Think of this almost the way that like animals have their base instincts. Birds know how to fly. Fish know how to swim. Frogs, when they're tadpoles, know when it's time to go to land or go to water. Almost, it kind of is just describing instincts that are natural. But he believed that this was this like pool of, and that in some way eventually we'd be able to tap into and recognize that as a species we have this collective unconscious underneath the surface of our ancestral past, our human experiences. He especially looked at religion to prove that, or to try to prove that, and say that like across the world, people that have never even civilizations that have never come into contact with others, most every society has their version of a religious or foundation myth, and they're all very similar. They all have a lot of similarities. There are common themes that are always there, and so he said that's proof of a collective unconscious, that we're born with certain drives, desires, and some of these things that just naturally push us towards propensity towards things like religion. So this is more or less disagreed with by most psychologists, but it was a big step away from kind of the Freudian aspects of it. So not so much experience, but a collective thing that we're born with. Karen Horney, that's EYE is kind of the pronunciation there. She is mostly known for shifting Freudian psychology away from the very sexist aspects. She had a major problem, rightfully, with his idea of penis envy, and said that the male-female difference isn't, sex. It's not gender. It has a lot less to do with biology and a lot more to do with culture and socialization. That's what most makes up most of the difference. He's like, the reason that women would have penis envy isn't because they naturally feel shorted because they don't have a penis, this extra appendage. They feel shorted because society values males, especially in the early 1900s. That society is going to value male input much more than it would female. So she says that clearly these ideas of Freud are very sexist and based on the times. So we need to look a lot more at culture and society, socialization more than just biology and sexual development. So big critiques of Freud's psychosexual theories. Pulls it a lot more towards the social aspects than the biological side. Alfred Adler is one that has given us a lot of theories that have kind of stuck around. One of those is the inferiority complex. This one, most psychologists agree, is a form of defense mechanism, so they put it there and say that it's more or less believable and proven at this point. When people have their power removed, when people are helpless, oftentimes when kids are abused or have that feelings of weakness, inadequacy, maybe based on relationships between their peers or with their parents, they develop this inferiority complex that often shows itself either by over exaggeration. Right, by people that are like, well, I'm awesome. And they will tell you constantly about all their amazing accomplishments. And they're like, well, I'm really good at this, right? Or I'm actually amazing at this. I can help, even when they might not be awesome at that. So some do this in another way, which is a little bit more healthy, which is about like trying to self-develop. You look at, they pointed at often, I think you could probably prove this theory to some extent, looking like the life of like Teddy Roosevelt, spent his first 12 years of life essentially bedridden, with different versions of pneumonia and asthma, nearly died multiple times, like couldn't breathe, always wanted to go outside but couldn't because his seasonal allergies were so bad they almost killed him every year, like an extremely sickly kid. And then when he was like 12, just like made up his mind, he's like, I'm not going to let that pull me down. I am going to improve myself. And so he became obsessed with exercise, going outside, improving himself. And by the time he, maybe I guess before he became president, right? He was a well-known athlete. When he was the president, he got the like most famous boxers in the world would come and visit him and fight him in the basement. Like he just became obsessed with his physical fitness because of feeling so inferior his entire childhood. He wanted to feel that he was as good as those others around him. So that's inferiority complex. Adler also is who gave us this like birth order theory. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges to that. This is something that most of you all know and understand, that the dynamics of having older siblings, younger siblings, being an only child, there are definitely stereotypes associated with that. I fit very much into the firstborn, and my sister falls much more into that like lastborn, and that we're the only two siblings, right? Like the theory is usually that the oldest is one that had a lot more pressure, a lot more attention from their parents, and so they're more focused, driven, a perfectionist, an achiever, and the younger typically more social and outgoing, charming, things like that, more fun. So this has some basis, right? Like there are parts of this that are scientifically proven, but for the most part, families are so varied that there's not enough statistically significant data that proves this. This is much more of kind of a stereotype. Sometimes it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we often treated it more of a confirmation bias. Right, we're like, oh, they're such an only child, and we look for evidence, and if they do one thing that shows that they're an only child, we're like, clearly the birth order theory is correct. Right, so yeah. So here's some data I looked up just a little bit to kind of help you on that. Show some examples. The only statistically significant, and it's not by much, right? The only statistically significant piece that shows a difference between siblings is IQ scores. And it's not much. Again, a statistically significant difference, the heritability there, or the difference that can be attributed to, not heritability, but the difference that can be attributed to birth order. in a cause and effect relationship. IQ scores are the only thing that is proven. You can see that here that you want to go back and look at this. This PowerPoint is on Classroom if you want to dig through this a little bit, these different charts. The rest of these, you can see extroversion. The usual assumption is that the youngest child is going to be more, but like they're all over the place. Right. Same thing here with emotional stability. It's all over the place. Agreeableness, differences between oldest, youngest. Right. So there's just no real consistency on the rest of these. But in IQ, there is a slight difference, right? There's a slight difference, and enough to be, not by much, but statistically significant, in that on average, the older a child, the slightly more increased, has a higher likelihood of having a higher IQ. And I think you can probably guess as to why, right? Because it's very small. This shows us that, like, yes, nature matters in IQ. We've said it's a big part of it, but nurture is also a big piece of it as well. Right, we're born with like that spectrum of possibilities for our IQs, and then the way that we are treated as children is what shapes how far we go up or down on our IQ possibilities. And oftentimes, oldest children get way more attention than younger children who are probably born with relatively similar IQ scales of possibility because they're related. And then the attention of parents, and oftentimes, is what's going to push them a little bit more for that. So not a whole lot of data that proves it, much more kind of a stereotype than anything else. So you can likely think of people who very much fit into this, and that's fine. But again, the data doesn't back it up. So last thing for 10.1b is going to be these PPAs, or projective personality assessments. You all have likely taken one of these at some point. Things like the Myers-Briggs. We aren't going to focus on that as much right now. I want to focus a little bit more on the ones that are used to try to understand the unconscious, right? Which is more what Freud and Jung and Adler and what they were trying to do. So what these are trying to do is figure out your unconscious, because right, we said there's no real way to test this. We can see we haven't mapped the brain out enough to understand and kind of visualize it. Right, we don't really know what's happening in there when our neurons are firing. We can like, well, that route does this, or that route usually is related to that, but we don't know for sure what's going on. So what we do is we do these projective personality assessments, and we ask people questions and allow them to talk in a way that psychologists have tried to show would reveal their unconscious beliefs in some way. So remember, people used to think it was dreams. No real data for that. These have mixed results. So the first was the TAT, the thematic apperception test. And this one has some data to back it up. So you basically give a subject an image. Right? You would say, for instance, look at this image. Right? Tell me a story of what's happening there. That's it. That's the test. And then the psychologist would be taking notes, writing that down, figuring out, and just like probably trying to underline and highlight like the big things they said. Like, what's the relationship between these people? You don't know. You could say it's like, that's somebody, like, they're very sad that their dad just died and they're traumatized and they're worried about the rest of their life. And then the psychologist might think, like, okay, so that's some fear that they've got going on. And the belief is that this brings out your gut reaction. Remember the very first day of class, we did some like psychoanalysis where I said, give me the first word that comes to mind, very first word. And that's supposed to be our unconscious thoughts. Doing that with a story on these has a little bit more value than just saying a single word, right? So if you're asked to quickly develop a story, oftentimes the first things that come to mind are related to those kind of unconscious feelings, thoughts, and desires. So say what's the outcome, who the characters are, what's happening, what they're thinking and feeling. This can kind of show people what you're thinking and what you're worried about. And again, there's some data to back this up, that like this is a little bit more effective in revealing concerns, drives, worries. This has slightly more significant projective value, or valid data when it comes to predicting different disorders, right? So different kind of especially social and emotional disorders. The TAT works in that. The ink block the Rorschach ink block test is a little bit more popular, and most people think of it when they think of psychology. It doesn't have as much good data. This was the first major test. They Jackson Pollocked a paper, smushed it together, and said, "What do you see?" It doesn't do a whole lot. It has some validity to it when you're trying to predict. It was like severe mental. How was it? It was like severe mentally social disorders. Like it can predict several things that are extremely intense, but you shouldn't need the Rorschach test to do that. You should be able to do that in just a normal conversation. So it doesn't have a lot of predictive validity or reliability. And like the other, it's entirely subjective. Major pros of these PPAs are they're about the only way we can look into the unconscious. We have no science that can do that. And it is a decent diagnostic tool, especially the TAT, for these psych disorders. Or we'll try to focus on those after May 15th. We'll come back to them. They're not going to be on the test, but this is a good diagnostic tool for major psych disorders. Cons, though, are that they are time consuming. You have to have one-on-one. You have to have somebody trained to be able to read people's reactions. And who knows how consistent that person is? How well trained are they? This is entirely subjective. If you got somebody like Freud reading it, they'd be like, clearly you want to have sex with your mother. They would make up some weird sexual disorder because that's what they're obsessed with, right? They're looking for confirmation bias to prove their theories in some way. So whoever your examiner is doesn't work. This is why we've needed a little bit more. Things like artificial intelligence are going to make a big difference in these. And we are trying to improve this through like computer aided tools that basically, like with all AI, it's like reading the data of like thousands of responses on a TAT or a Rorschach, which less valid, and then say, based on that, 60% of people that have given similar response, treatment effort has been this, or their responses have been this. So the more data we kind of plug into these computer-aided tools, the better that will become. And they really only work again for more like serious hostility and anxiety disorders. For the most part, you can't really tell the difference between somebody with serious childhood trauma and people with creative minds. That can make things very difficult. So they're wildly unreliable for the most part. But the TAT is slightly better than the Rorschach. So we'll call it the day there. Again, projective personality tests, not super valid, not super reliable. They are a little bit more valid, especially the TAT, the Rorschach, not so much. But we will stop there for 10.1b. Call it a day.